Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Seth Maskett. I'm a professor of political science and director of the Center on American Politics here at the University of Denver. We've been doing a number of events this year. We're pleased to be able to host this one both in person and online. We appreciate all of you who are able to join us today in either format, especially to our live studio audience here. We've also been able to host a few politics hours along with our friends at the C Center. We plan on doing more of those in the winter and spring. Please watch our website for upcoming events. We are very pleased by our support from and our partnership with the Scrivener Institute of Public Policy and the Korbel School of International Studies. Thank you especially to Katie Aker for help bringing this event to life today. In just a week, many of us will be traveling to visit family or welcome travelers to our homes for Thanksgiving. And before we've even brined the turkey, which you should do, we're going to be arguing with a creepy uncle or an annoying cousin or a grumpy grandparent about politics. Some of it will be trivial. Some of it will be pretty consequential and personal. As a lot of recent research has shown, polarization is covering a lot of ground right now. Our partisan identities overlap with many other identities, including race, class, education, gender, and more. Here to tell us how this all works, how we got to this place, and what we can do about it is political scientist Christopher Celaya. Chris is in his second year as a postdoctoral researcher here at the Center on American Politics. His work investigates how theories of political identity can be leveraged to inform more productive political communication, to increase citizen knowledge, and to foster sophisticated thinking about politics. He holds a PhD in political science from Harvard, and he's a former research fellow with the Mind-Brain Behavior Interfaculty Initiative. Here's how this will work. Chris is going to speak for about 45 minutes. We will then open things up to your questions, both from the in-person crowd and the online crowd. If you're participating over Zoom and would like to ask a question, please type it in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to answer as many of your questions as we can. I'll be fielding questions as they come in. Again, if you want to ask us a question, please use the Q&A. Without further ado, here is Chris Celaya. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth, and thank you for that introduction. When you put it that way, it makes me sound pretty good, so thanks. And thank you all for showing up, everyone here and everyone on Zoom as well. My name is Chris Celaya, as Seth pointed out, and this talk is called Talking About Politics on Thanksgiving. And this talk is motivated by these increasing levels of partisan polarization and animosity in American politics. And so I'm largely going to focus on ways to depolarize people in order to have meaningful political communication. Conversations that people often try to avoid over the holidays. You can see here, I found memes for everything for this talk. So, be sure to bring up politics at Thanksgiving dinner. It's going to save you money on Christmas gifts, right? The joke being your family's not going to want to talk to you anymore after you talk about politics. But I don't think that has to be the case, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about kind of the theories and leverage evidence from multiple academic disciplines, from psychology, sociology, social science, political communication, knowledge management, all these other disciplines, to kind of give a holistic picture of what's happening when people are becoming polarized, and then what we can do, what the research says we can do to try to depolarize people ourselves, right? And so to that end, I'm going to briefly explain what polarization is and highlight some reasons why it's increasing. And I'm going to talk about the psychological mechanisms of polarization, followed by some strategies we can use to reduce polarization. And finally, as a bonus, I'm going to give you all a minor superpower at the very end. Okay, so stay tuned. So what is political polarization? Political polarization is just a measure of how groups are separated in ideological space. And what do I mean by ideological space? I just mean that if you were to map people's preferences on a grid, more polarized groups would be further from each other and then less polarized groups. For example, this is a representation from a process called Nominate that shows polarization in Congress about economic issues. Right, and this is kind of the standard process that we use in political science to determine polarization in Congress. And if we look over time, we can see that polarization in both the House and the Senate is higher than it's ever been between the Democratic and Republican parties, even higher than during the Civil War. Right, so this isn't a minor problem. But we also see this for individuals, and people increasingly think that people from the opposing party are ideologically distant. Individuals are becoming increasingly polarized about politicians and other voters, but also about policy issues such as financial aid to Black Americans, abortion, government involvement in the economy, and health insurance. And there are a number of reasons why political polarization is increasing in the United States. There are structural factors such as changes to the party primary system, which now tend to favor more extreme voters over more moderate ones. There are demographic factors such as party members sorting into different geographic regions, making places more solidly red or blue. There's policy factors, the most important of which I'll talk about shortly, which is that we're shifting our political attention more to moral issues. There's changes in the media landscape, such as the elimination of the fairness doctrine and the rise of new media and social media, leading to echo chambers and easy collective outrage. And there's certain very effective political actors, such as Rush Limbaugh and Bernie Sanders, that have also pushed their respective parties further to the right and left through their rhetoric and leadership. And while it's important to be aware of these changes, for the most part, these are monolithic and they're not things that we personally can change. Like we can try to have an effect on them by the way we vote and what bills we support. But by and large, the one thing we can do is we can change how we individually talk about politics, right? And that's where my talk's going to focus. But before I get to some of these specific strategies, I feel it's important to discuss the theories and research to make these recommendations make sense for you, right? So polarization is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be useful and even necessary to a spirited democracy to have two cohesive, contrasting visions for how to proceed, and both can be potentially viable. So for example, imagine if we were divided on whether to spend surplus tax revenues on space exploration or social welfare programs to help the less fortunate. Both are potentially beneficial goals, and we wouldn't necessarily say it was a problem if people were polarized about where to spend this money. More problematic is something that's called affective polarization. And this is what's really driving this kind of animosity in the United States. So affective polarization is when people attach negative emotions to the differences that they perceive between in-group and out-group members. Unfortunately, this too is on the rise. And to understand affective polarization, you have to understand social identity. So this is gonna go way back to some pretty basic psychology, but basically humans experience distress when they don't feel secure in their understanding of the world, right? We're psychologically motivated with a need to understand, and understanding provides us security and self-esteem. When we don't understand how the world works, we don't have a basis to discern how we're supposed to act and feel, and it can lead to feeling lost and thus frightened. But how can humans understand a complex world? Humans simultaneously live in two different worlds. We live in an empirical world of facts, such as your height, how many people live within a geographic area, what temperature it is, but we also live in a social world of norms and values, such as what it means to be a good person, expectations based on our personal characteristics, roles in society, etc. And though these two worlds are fundamentally different, our brains perceive them as equally real. And for most people, the empirical world is mysterious and out of our control. We don't have the cognitive tools to intuitively understand complex physical phenomena. Fortunately for our self-esteem, we're able to turn to the social world to try to have these needs met instead. And there are many ways to try to develop an understanding of the social world. For example, many people lean into their careers to both develop an understanding of how that world works and to feel secure in having established roles and expectations. But one of the easiest ways to get a worldview is through group membership and identity. We're hardwired to find a group, and falling into a group is ridiculously easy. Robust research, beginning with Henry Tajfel in the 1970s, has demonstrated that people will accept a group identity with almost trivial prompting. And Tajfel developed what is known as social identity theory, which posits that people join groups because they provide a sense of belonging and esteem. But social identity theory also says that once we are in a group, we're hardwired to make group comparisons and to act on behalf of our group. And our esteem grows when we think our group is superior to the other groups because it's a reflection of us. A key component in understanding affective polarization is an idea called entitativity. It's a weird word, I know. But entitative groups are groups that seem more cohesive and more coherent. And research has shown that groups perceived as more entitative are also perceived as more extreme. The two political parties in the United States are likewise becoming more entitative on a number of dimensions. For example, liberals in America are becoming less religious. Women are increasingly likely to lean toward the Democratic Party. Black and Hispanic Americans are also moving to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has become home to people with diverse sexual orientations, and Democrats and Republicans are even physically separating themselves geographically, seen here. And this phenomenon is known as sorting. In a paper that came out this year, Iyengar et al. State, in essence, ideological sorting has made it much easier for partisans to make generalized inferences about the opposing side, even if those inferences are inaccurate. But this kind of sorting alone isn't sufficient for affective polarization. These groups tend to only care about getting a relative advantage over each other, not about, they don't necessarily express negative attitudes toward each other. There is one consistent condition that when that does happen though, and that's when these groups start to compete over moral issues. And research has found that to be the case. Moral issues are especially pernicious when groups fight over them for two main reasons. First, for moral issues, there's no objective right answer in the moral world. Moral arguments are based on premises, but premises are merely stipulated. They can't often be proven. So if you consider something like the abortion debate, people who identify as pro-choice typically stipulate that a woman's bodily autonomy is more important than the preservation of a fetus. People who identify as pro-life stipulate that the preservation of the fetus is more important. But there's no objective manual of the universe that can resolve this claim. It's not like a factual claim where you can test it and find an answer. It's a social claim, a claim about values and norms. And as such, it's a disagreement that can be carried on indefinitely if neither side wants to relent. But moral competition is also pernicious in that it represents a threat to one's worldview, especially about their group membership. We know that people derive their esteem from understanding the world around them. And the opposite becomes true when that world is called into question. It feels bad to have that view challenged. This bad feeling is called cognitive dissonance, and people will go to great lengths to avoid this kind of dissonance, and will usually react to it with defensiveness, hence the affective part of polarization. When one's worldview is attacked, that person will feel like they're personally under attack, and thus the attacker becomes the enemy. So what exactly do I mean when I say a moral issue? It can be a debate over a values-based issue or policy, such as same-sex marriage, or it can mean that the groups themselves are being moralized, which tends to follow from that kind of competition. When conservatives say that liberals are socialists, or when liberals say that conservatives are fascists, they're making a moral claim about the nature of the outgroup. In a sense, they are saying that the outgroup members and their ideology are evil. And of course, we want to get rid of evil. We want to attack it. But that's not compatible with democracy when you're attacking the people themselves. And if we go back to this polarization over time graph, we can almost see this moralizing happen in real time. And it mostly kicked off during the civil rights movement. This movement normalized moral politics in the US, setting the stage for affective polarization. This was followed shortly by Roe v. Wade, protecting the right to abortion, and later Bowers v. Hardwick, which found that there was no constitutional protection for sodomy, and later Lawrence v. Texas, which overturned Bowers. Now, this isn't to say that these aren't important things that we shouldn't have done, right? But it's part of the story about why we're becoming affectively polarized. Now, so far, I've talked about conflict over social truths. But what about when groups disagree about empirical facts? In 2017, Kellyanne Conway first popularized the phrase alternative facts. And this idea highlighted another important element of polarization. When people are affectively polarized, they derive their esteem from distinguishing themselves from the outgroup. This becomes problematic when the outgroup politicizes a factual issue. If people are affectively polarized, it is very difficult for them to admit that the outgroup can be right about anything. Consider the polarization around COVID-19. In a recent study on how affective polarization shapes responses to COVID policy, Druckmann et al. Write, people are motivated to do the opposite of what the other disliked party endorses. They do this because the out-party animus is so strong that they want to differentiate themselves from that disliked party. I should point out that as of right now, the majority of people in both the Democratic and the Republican parties are vaccinated, but there are still significant differences between the two, and so we can use this as a kind of a case study. For a number of reasons, blue states generally implemented strict COVID protocols early on in the pandemic. One reason is that the initial COVID hotspots were in liberal areas of the country, such as New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. Early on in the pandemic, As it was hitting blue states the hardest, the political right started to conceive of the virus as a blue state problem. And some of the more affectively polarized conservatives appeared to express delight in this apparent reality. Polling at the time, and even to this day, showed that conservatives were much less concerned with the virus than liberals. But as the empirical reality of the virus demonstrated that it affected blue states and red states alike, those conservatives had a choice to make: admit that they were wrong about the facts of the virus and give a win to liberals, or hunker down into the social reality that they had created to maintain their worldview. And because the former would lead to dissonance and a reduction in esteem, many conservatives instead chose the social reality over the empirical one. However, Druckmann et al. Also found that resistance to COVID policy was muted in states hardest hit by the virus. So empirical reality can shock people out of their social reality. We also see this in things like the vaccine mandates, where a bunch of people were threatening to quit their jobs if they were mandated to get a vaccine. And then it turned out that very few of them actually did that. We also see anecdotal, stories of people in hospitals who had previously doubted the efficacy of the vaccine, and then they got sick, and then they regretted their decision, and they were advocating for people to also get vaccinated. So this isn't set in stone. And liberals aren't immune to this affective polarization either. And if you look at social media today, you can see that people on the left are disturbingly expressing righteous indignation about the fact that conservatives are now the ones that are likely to die from COVID. And if these kinds of memes feel right to you, then it might indicate that you are affectively polarized. But it's important to remember that what feels good isn't always what's good for society. And spreading messages like this might have the unintended consequence of increasing the kinds of behaviors that you're criticizing in the first place. So what we ultimately end up with is that humans are motivated to seek esteem, and one of the most important places they find esteem is by joining groups, which we are predisposed to do. As groups become more constrained, it becomes easier to discriminate between them. And when these groups find themselves in competition, especially moral competition, it breeds affective polarization. And people get the self-esteem they need both from kind of the demeaning of the outgroup. They get their self-esteem from like benefiting their own group, but also from demeaning the outgroup. And that can actually lead to violence as well. And having the outgroup as a scapegoat is so effective because it's basically a life hack for self-esteem. And this is why so many demagogues try to drum up anger at outgroups when they're seeking power. Okay, so that's kind of in a nutshell the psychology of what's going on, and how can we use that to understand how to resist affective polarization in our daily lives. So here I'll outline several conversational approaches that can reduce affective polarization when you discuss politics, hopefully allowing you to have a more pleasant holiday season. Okay. So in order to be able to discuss politics with someone who's affectively polarized, you have to recognize that their worldview is personal. If their worldview gets attacked or interrogated, it's going to feel like they are being attacked or interrogated. As difficult as it might be, especially when you feel someone else's politics are odious, you have to understand that their preferences are currently a part of them. And if you attack them, you're not going to get anywhere. And I want to stress that this doesn't mean you can't disagree or even argue with people, but there are better and worse ways of doing so, right? So first and foremost, and I can't stress this enough, stop with the gotcha memes, okay? All these gotchas are the current front in the culture war. And while they may feel delightful, they're also pushing us further apart. You can make a case for why you believe your position is correct and your opponent's is faulty. But when you do it in such a way that also embarrasses them and makes them look even more distinct from you, they're going to react with defensiveness and hostility, and they're going to become more of the thing that you're critiquing in the first place. Put another way, when you push people further into their horrible behavior, you're partly responsible for it, right? So instead, just keep it substantive and focused on facts. Based on, for example, based on both academic research and the fact that Bush tried steel tariffs in 2002 and it backfired, there's good reason to think that the Trump tariffs will also fail, right? Straightforward, get to the point. There's no you involved in that sentence. You think this, you're like this, or whatever. Make your argument, but don't push people away when you're doing it because they're not going to listen, right? Note also how I didn't use any definitive statements here. Almost nothing in politics is certain. And so it's useful, disarming, and also often more accurate to use indefinite language such as likely, probably, seems reasonable, etc. It's also an easier position to defend, and it allows for the possibility that the other person might be right, which can prevent defensiveness on their part. This should go without saying, but be respectful and recognize that there's a logic to what people believe. That logic may be based on some social construct that you don't recognize or believe in, but nevertheless, it's a part of their worldview. And like I said, the worldview seems real. It's as real to them as your beliefs and your understandings are to you. This doesn't mean you have to agree with what they're saying, just that you have to understand where they're coming from. So you can try something like, okay, I can see where you're coming from. I'm coming from a different place, so that reasoning doesn't really work for me, but it makes sense, right? I understand the logic of what you're saying. I disagree with your premises, right? But sometimes the best you can do is just to expose somebody else to your point of view. Even if you can't convince someone to agree with you on an issue, it can still be valuable for them to understand your reasoning and to understand why you care about an issue. But even here, you have to be tactful. You don't just want to push arguments onto someone, make it reciprocal and respectful. You might not like your conversation's partner's position, but if you like them, it shouldn't be too hard to care about what they think and why they think it. So you can try something like, you clearly have a strong position on this issue, so do I. I don't think I'm going to change your mind. I don't think you'll change mine, but I'm still interested in your reasons. Why don't you tell me why you feel the way you do, and I'll tell you why I feel the way I do, so at least we understand where we're coming from. Oh, and this approach has an added benefit. An experimental study from 2013 found that when you ask people to explain a complicated issue, they tend to decrease their levels of polarization because they start to realize in real time just how complex these issues are, and they hadn't actually thought through them completely. And this can make them more open to what you have to say as well. All right, knowing people are getting their esteem from the social world is also key to discussing politics in an affectively polarized world. Directly disputing factually incorrect information may seem like the best approach, but if done poorly, it can lead to entrenchment and more polarization rather than consensus. Again, consider the COVID-19 example from earlier. One thing you don't want to do is ignore someone's position just because you don't agree with it. People can sense when you're dismissing them, and they're going to get both offended and they're going to discount what you have to say as well. Even if you are sure someone is factually incorrect, it will still be useful to recognize that your partner has taken the time and cognitive effort to develop a worldview and that it is very real to them. Using phrases like these can get the other person to open up and give you the same kind of consideration when you make your points. I can see you've done a lot of research on this topic. I can tell you really care about this issue. I know that a lot of people feel the way that you do, and I respect that. All of these are, often true facts, right? People have actually done their research, even if you don't agree with their methods or their findings. But you do want to recognize that people are actually invested. They're not just getting this opinion out of nowhere, right? This has been developed. And recognizing where people get their esteem also means recognizing the importance of their group, especially their group leaders for their own esteem. So we know that people are more likely to be persuaded by people they perceive to be experts, and that following the advice of a trusted expert can potentially break them from their polarized stances. Unfortunately, when someone is affectively polarized, they will be less likely to rely on experts that they also perceive as partisan. Instead, try to leverage information from leaders that they are likely to trust. So for example, if you're talking to conservatives that are resisting, getting a vaccine, instead of pointing out that all the scientists are advocating for it, you could point out that even Donald Trump says you should get the vaccine, and all the reporters at Fox News are vaccinated, and they don't appear to be afraid of it, right? These are trusted sources for conservatives. Right. You can also leverage some psychology to covertly reduce affective polarization. So one of the biggest findings in social psychology is something called the contact hypothesis. And Gordon Allport demonstrated that if 4 conditions are present, groups will reduce their prejudice against each other and even come to like and respect each other. So the 4 conditions are: groups must share a common goal, they must cooperate in seeking that goal, they must have equal status, and they have to have social support. So I already talked about how competition leads to discrimination and affective polarization. So it shouldn't be surprising that cooperation in pursuit of a common goal can help reduce intergroup conflict. Allport also demonstrated the importance of equal status and the need for social support. Equal status is straightforward. Members of groups should just recognize that outgroup members have just as much of a right to seek their goals as in-group members do. The need for social support is a little more nuanced, but basically it requires that both parties feel there's an overarching social norm of cooperating and equality, and that the goal is desirable. So when talking about politics, you can try to emulate these conditions of the contact hypothesis to reduce differences and negative affect. Ask a conversation partner if you can compare sources together to try to get a better understanding of a political topic. Make the discussion a joint effort, a collaboration, rather than a competition. Highlight your similarities. Like, we've both looked into this and probably have a lot of information to share. And remind your partner of the political norms. We should be respectful. It's important that we can be agreeable in a democracy, even if we agree to disagree. Another hack comes from an article written this year, which demonstrates that when partisans are exposed to non-political news articles, even from sources they usually don't like, it reduces their opposition to these sources. This is more of a long-term hack where, for example, you can send recipes, product reviews, or non-political reporting to family members to break them from their insular news consumption habits. The psychological mechanism for what's happening here is called the dilution effect. So the dilution effect is a robust finding in psychology that says that the more information you know about something, the less harshly you're likely to judge that thing, right? So if you're a Democrat, think of a typical Republican. And if you're a Republican, think of a typical Democrat. Odds are you have a fairly specific conception of this. But when I start to give you more information, such as this person owns a Toyota, this person prefers tea over coffee, this person's a cat owner, it starts to break apart the idea that any one individual matches this ideal type in your head. Our brains want to put everything into neat little categories to make life simpler, but we can override that type of thinking by providing information that defies those stereotypes. In other words, diluting someone's identity can help dilute their group's entitativity. Again, that word. So if you want to talk to conservatives about Joe Biden, you might try to mention more than just politics. You can talk about how he's a dog owner, about how he played high school football, about the fact that he's a widower. Or if you want to talk about Trump, you might bring up how he doesn't drink alcohol, that he was in the movie Home Alone, or his Scottish and German heritage. Dilution doesn't even have to be positive information. Neutral information has been shown to work. But since you're trying to dilute ideological affect, you wouldn't want to use ideological information to say, well, George Bush supported this, Joe Biden or Donald Trump supported this policy or whatever. That's not going to work, right? It needs to be unrelated to the thing that they're judging in the first place. Okay, so one of my guilty pleasures for the last few years has been commenting on news sites. And I'd always thought that you could just, come up with the best argument and it would convince people to agree with you. And as you can imagine in this context, which was anonymous and polarized, the strategy led nowhere. And I was constantly accused of being a shill or a political operative trying to trick people. But I noticed that whenever I mentioned I was a veteran, it was like night and day, right? People said they respectfully disagreed with me. They were providing their sources. They sent book recommendations. And one person even said, oh, you're not really liberal. You're just confused. You're really one of us, right? And so it's like, I had successfully diluted their perception of me as this hypothetical ideal liberal. And I actually got to some good, meaningful political communication, even in this, really difficult to communicate environment. The next remedy comes from, by the way, this is my favorite social science theory of all time. The next remedy comes from a sociologist named Charles Cooley. And in 1902, he developed a theory called the looking glass self. So there's a subdiscipline in sociology called symbolic interactionism. And basically the idea is we learn about the world by seeing how other people interact with the world. We learn it socially. Cooley's key insight was that this is also how we learn who we are, right? We see what people reflect back to us, and it creates norms and roles and expectations for ourselves, right? And that's even the case when there are things that we might otherwise think are negative, right? When people like bolster someone to act like a class clown, or when people are socially pressured into like joining organized crime or things like that. And the main takeaway here is that when we discuss politics, we need to be aware of our contributions to other people's roles. We can actually push people into the roles we mean to criticize if we do it in a way that makes them defensive. So consider the following memes. All right, this is a common, so here you see, here's a meme critiquing Republicans. 2 things Republicans hate: being called a racist and brown people. So this is a common refrain from people who want to critique the Republican Party and conservatism. And I've seen variations on this all over social media. And of course, racism is a real problem. I'm not saying you shouldn't address racism, but you have to be careful about the ways that you do address it. Because if someone is affectively polarized against you and you highlight that difference and at the same time morally critique them, there's a good chance they'll lean into that critique in order to distinguish themselves from you, just like what Druckmann was talking about, I mentioned earlier. And so you end up stuff like this, where people twist your critique to fit their worldview. They lean into it, right? Here we see someone saying, oh, I am a racist. I'm a Republican against communist, insane social terrorism. Are you a racist too? And proud of it, right? But it can be even worse. It can also lead to things like this, where your critiques are openly embraced, where people identify as anti-racist because you're anti-racist, or vice versa. And there's a couple other examples. For example, when Republicans leaned into the label of deplorable, you know, Hillary Clinton and running for the presidency in 2016, said that part of the Republican Party was, you know, consisted of a basket of deplorables. And that you can see in real time, like Republicans embrace that. Okay, we're the deplorables, deplorable lives matter. And you see the same thing happening on the left, where people on the left are embracing socialism, and not just kind of like, you know, social democratic socialism that you know, like Bernie Sanders is advocating for, but like hardcore down with capitalism, complete restructuring of our political system, which I'm not saying that's good or bad, but you know, you can see how that's being pushed by this kind of like labeling. Because if you call someone a socialist, no matter what policy they support, merely because they are on the other team, they have no incentive to back away from that position. You have to make space for people to be able to come back together. And when you label someone as distinctly different from yourself, you've eliminated that space. Okay, finally, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I'm going to give you a minor superpower. So Cooley's looking glass self shows us that we learn who we are by what's reflected back to us. But the corollary to this is that we have some power to project onto other people who we would like them to be as well. So if you want your extremist relatives to be less extreme, more reasonable, more respectful, or more thoughtful, you might have some success by merely treating them like they already are those things, right? So for example, you could say, I've always thought of you as somebody who makes decisions based on evidence. I appreciate how important this issue is to you and that you have people's best interests in mind. You've seemed to have studied this issue a lot. Can we compare sources and then try to figure out where this disagreement is coming from? Affectively polarized people aren't deficient. They're just motivated to believe and act in a certain way. But you can appeal to a person's individual identity as opposed to their social identity to motivate them to act in a different way. And that's a powerful ability. So occasionally I'll try to have a conversation with somebody who's like belligerently affectively polarized and seemingly overcome, right? To the point where I initially assumed there's no way this is gonna work. But in multiple instances, I've said something like, is that how you were raised to talk to strangers, right? Just to try to disarm somebody. And it was surprisingly effective at getting them to tone it down, because their individual identity as someone who respected their parents and considered themselves well-raised came into conflict with their social identity. And in these cases, I was actually able to carried on a conversation with their individual persona as opposed to their social persona, right? And so you have some power to like shape how, you know, people view themselves. Okay, I just have a couple more points to make and then I'll open it up to questions. The first I want to say is that for all these things I've said, we should also look in the mirror when we think about these kinds of strategies, right? None of us are immune to living in a social world, and all of us are vulnerable to group passions. It's important to recognize that we might also be affectively polarized, and that it can affect our own judgment and our ability to communicate. And finally, I just want to say we need to make a distinction between policies we don't like and the people who support these policies, okay? This is a democracy, and by many different kind of measures, a very diverse democracy, and we're always gonna have strong disagreements and struggles over policies. But a democracy can't function if the groups see each other as illegitimate or evil. You can't insult your way to victory in an ideological war. It's just gonna make the other side stronger. And barring something horrible, like an actual civil war, The only way to de-escalate is to accept that people have different values and preferences, and to enthusiastically accept those people as legitimate, even as you advocate against their policies. Right? We need to be able to engage with each other about policy, and we can't do that when we're affectively polarized. Okay, thank you. I'll open it up to questions. I know, oh, thank you. Yeah. Let me, let's see, let me stop sharing my screen here. 1 minute. And then, so I know, Kate, are you monitoring the, oh, Seth's one, okay. Well, let me find out, oh, here we go. Oh, there it is, yeah. Sorry, it's hard to manage my mouse from over there, okay. All right.
We actually have a question from an online. Thanks for the talk. When you said, is that how you were raised to speak? Was that something that you put in writing or something you said in person? In general, what differences have you noticed between strategies?
So that's a good question. So most of my conversation has been written. It's been, as I mentioned, I was doing the news comments. I talked to a lot of people on Facebook, especially over the last 2 years. I mean, I haven't seen anybody. I've been cooped up, you know, hiding from COVID. So I don't have a good sense. For me, it's a lot easier to communicate over writing, just because you have more time to think it out. It's a lot easier to like let affect, you know, control your speech when you're doing it in real time. And so I've noticed for me that it's kind of easier to take a step back, take a breath. You know, don't just type the first thing that comes to your mind, but you know, think it through, cool down a minute. I do think it can be harder in person, but for me, you know, most of these conversations are happening online. And so, yeah, that can be a challenge for, you know, when you're at Thanksgiving with your family in real time. But the same principles apply, and it's again, it's important to remember, if you go to the table and you already realize that your family is coming from somewhere, that they have a valid logic that they're working on, even if you don't agree with the premises. The premises are stipulated again, right? These are things that they're building their worldview off of. And if you come to it thinking, okay, they have this kind of like cohesive sense of policies and morals and et cetera, you know, instead of coming to the table confrontational, you can kind of avoid some of that affect to begin with, and it can be easier to talk about it in person. And by the way, if anyone here has a question, yeah, feel free to raise your hand. Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh, yeah, absolutely. So the question is am I advocating that these are things we need to have talks about? If I'm paraphrasing correctly, like, because people often think of the holidays as apolitical because they want to focus on the holiday. I think the first part of the question, yes, I think we do need to have these kinds of discussions. To the second part of the question, I don't think we need to have them over the holidays, right? So it's just that the holidays are coming up, and a lot of times that's when people are more likely to interact with their family, and so yeah, we kind of like use that as a kind of like framing for this talk, but yeah, as I was kind of like, you know, concluding at the end there, I think these conversations are terribly important for democracy, right? We need to be able to negotiate our way to having policies that are kind of, I mean, this is kind of, I don't want to go too deeply into like democratic theory, but like a lot of democratic theory, you know, especially like participatory democracy and deliberative democracy, which I've studied, is very much about, you know, we need to be engaged in this kind of way. So I personally would advocate for it. You know, and if the other reason I advocate for it is because I think we do actually have some power to, even if it's a small amount, to reverse this kind of affective polarization that's happening in America, because I think that is a real problem. I think it's a very, very big problem. And so I think it's useful for that reason too. Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned that in order to have productive discourse,
yep.
But especially in media style policies that have
Mm-hmm.
So how do you address the skeptics in that when you get past that? Sometimes the bias that they want to done is that we're capable of fully understanding.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you first and foremost point out that you are a college student and you're learning how to learn about these issues, right? A lot of times what I'll do, which I find helps to disarm that kind of rhetoric is, I mean, well, first of all, hopefully you're leveraging some kind of like evidence to support your position. And so you don't have to rely on your personal credibility, right? You can say, well, I'm basing this off of like, immunologists, or I'm basing this off of economists or whatever, right? And so, and again, I think the first step should be to get the person to engage in the conversation, right? It's not, the thing is, especially when it comes to things like values, there's very little of actually changing somebody's values, right? It's very difficult to do if they're like set on them, right? And so, but what you can do is, if you're tactful and thoughtful and you can use some of these strategies, is to get someone to recognize your values as well. And so that they might, so they're not going to say, oh, your policy is just pure evil. It's, oh, your policy makes sense for you because you have these values. I don't agree with them, but at least I understand where you're coming from, so I don't hate you for supporting them, right? Yeah. Yeah.
We return back to dynamic environment where our needs are constantly challenged, whereas our return to one that's more static.
Mm-hmm.
What's the purpose of having these discussions if we're just
Oh yeah, sorry. I forgot to do that on the last one. So what's the value of having these conversations with your parents if they're going to go back basically into their bubble after you leave on the holidays, right? So that's a good point. And it will likely, this extra exposure to the thing that they already, agree with is going to like push them back into that, their state that they were before you had this conversation. But it's not to say that it won't have an effect. So I have a couple thoughts. So one is, the ability to add kind of an extra frames about an issue into somebody's head, they're not going to disappear, right? If you actually give them a different perspective than they've had before, even if they're more likely to dismiss it, they'll at least have that cognitively available. And so when they hear like, if you can like get them to open up, so say Wolf Blitzer is telling your parents, oh, you're horrible for doing this and that, they're not going to listen, right? But if you tell your parents, well, hey, here's why it's important, they're going to develop these kind of like different schemas. And then that'll be available for the next time Wolf Blitzer says, hey, you should think about this issue. They'll be like, oh, wait, that makes sense. That actually comports with something my relative said. So I don't mean to suggest that I've solved, affective polarization and that you're going to have this like one-off conversation and it's going to fix the problem. But I think, it's kind of this thing where every little bit helps. The other thing I would say is you can, follow up on social media with your family. If you're more willing to talk to each other, it might be more pleasant to have, this constant communication with your family in the first place. And so maybe you can keep a running dialogue outside of the holidays. I'm not trying to tell you how to, engage with your family or anything like that. But it doesn't have to be a one-off event, right? And as, responding to this question from earlier, I don't think it does necessarily need to just, be around the holidays. I think it's something that we as democratic citizens ought to do on a regular basis. Yeah.
they are actually wrong. But let me go one step further and actually take the process from the perspective of actually they are not wrong. Maybe we can go there to learn and actually find using a constructive space where we find our own thinking by getting more input about it. And then obviously essentially requires that we are more open to handling dissonance when it comes to us. So that we become more mature and we can actually deal with the situation where we realize that we're wrong about something. Further, we need to also, not during the holidays, we cannot do that. But also develop a educational system or support mechanisms in general so people can have dissonance. And we don't have to necessarily only resort to these ways of tricking them into becoming more less aggressive and less defensive about the situation, but actually putting also responsibility on them to actually be able to deal with these things. But all this can be done maybe under education without maybe because kids look at a bubble and don't necessarily want to hurt their feelings. But it's important sometimes to actually put them in different situations where they are confronted with the reality, and they have to learn slowly how to resolve this situation.
Yeah, so I'll try to paraphrase so everyone can hear me. That was a lot though. So first and foremost, I think I got it. So this idea that that maybe I was framing the talk in maybe I can like hack people's brains to get them to like see things from my perspective. Whereas maybe it would be just as important to realize that, you know, I might be wrong about something. I hope I was kind of like suggesting that that's part of it, that we need to be aware of our own affective polarization. And also, I do want to back away from this idea that we should be trying to, well, I think that we should make good cases for why we think the way we do, why we support the policies we support. But as I kind of was suggesting earlier with the answer to a previous question, I don't think the way to go about that is to try to change someone else, right? At least not to change kind of their values, but more about kind of respecting. So I just want to like make a little distinction between like maybe what I heard you say, maybe I'm misinterpreting, and what I'm trying to say here. I'm trying to advocate for reducing affective polarization, not convincing people of certain arguments or whatever. But one of the side benefits of reducing affective polarization means people will be more open to each other's arguments. This other idea, which is an amazing question, which is how do we get people to be okay with cognitive dissonance? I love this idea. I kind of try to internalize that. And I think that you know, there are like, you know, Socratic disciplines that this is like kind of the whole, like, you know, be like, you kind of want to revel in this state of the unknown, right? And so I think it's possible. I think it's possible to do this like kind of socially or culturally. How to implement that? So I'm not a public policy person. How to implement that in you know, the American educational system seems like a Herculean task. I mean, especially because we're, you know, our federal system, you know, the states are doing this at different levels. So, but I do take your point. I think that there's room for this kind of instruction in higher education, and I think there's potential for that to be, you know, a bigger part of it. To be fair though, I do think a lot of at least science, social science and physical science is pretty good at training people not to jump to conclusions without evidence, right? And I think that that's kind of the other side of the coin of living in cognitive dissonance or living in a state of the unknown. But I do think there's more potential for that, and I'm all for that. I think that's amazing. I just, yeah. Is that? Yeah. I mean, there's so the human brain gets its kind of like pleasure from different, you know, activities, right? Some of them are hearing the things that you like to hear, and you know, feeling like you're part of a group, and you get this like collective effervescence. And then the other side is like these new experiences, these like dopamine, you know, interactions, where it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to challenge myself and I'm going to like learn new stuff or whatever. Yeah, and unfortunately, and I didn't really get into this. Honestly, this polarization talk was, I gave a lecture for Seth a week or two ago. And it was 2 hours on this pretty much the same subject material. And even then I was like, this isn't nearly enough time to go into it. Yeah, so a lot of the things that I did get into in that talk were the reasons that this kind of like, for example, this new media environment that I briefly touched on here, it just makes this kind of like easy pleasure from like, you know, the collective effervescence type of pleasure, it makes it so much more accessible. And on the other side of the coin, you know, policy and technology is becoming so much more complex as our world evolves, that the kind of like that approach to pleasure actually becomes a lot more difficult, right? And so I think there are these kind of like imbalances that's kind of like making it easier for, I think, you know, this is leading into this affective polarization story.
A little bit less of a question, just something I want to hear your opinion on.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like a lot of the examples you gave in terms of, you know, how to have a calm conversation with your family were very good, but they were under the assumption that you had a lot of information on it.
Yep.
And a position that I have seen myself into a lot is when you disagree with someone, but you clearly don't have enough, like as much information as someone else. And then for me, that's usually the state where things go from being, you know, a normal conversation between two people to something where you get revolted and you go like, oh, but you're stupid, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I just think, you know, in terms of like not having to resolve everything in one big debate and just kind of taking your time and being able to go back and read what they have,
yep,
but also read more of what you think, not together. So I just want to see yourself not being so hot-headed.
Yeah. So so the question is, if you don't have a lot of information, but you want to disagree with somebody, you might, you know, run into a wall with your arguments. And what do you do in that situation? So, well, one is get educated, right? I don't think that we should, you know, in a general sense, I don't think we should really have a strong opinion about something if we don't know very much about it, right? And this is, again, like going back to this point is, you know, we should learn to live in this state of the unknown. But the other thing I'll say is, so if you go into this conversation, you say, I have these 3 thoughts about this thing, and this is why I support it. And the other person comes at you with 50 things that demolish your argument or whatever, right? Pay attention to what they're saying, because that's going to inform what you're going to try to understand. And then you can find out, like, well, you might find out, oh, I didn't think of it from this perspective. And this also kind of harkens back to this idea that maybe I was wrong. Or B, it'll give you kind of the path to like make your own arguments based on your values once you understand what the other arguments are. So it's still going to be useful to you, and you don't have to, you should be overtly humble if you don't have that information, right? You can say like, I have some information, and this information I have has led me to feel this way. What do you think about that? And they're going to tell you their stuff. And you say, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know this stuff. I'm going to think about that. Maybe I'll do some of my own research, and maybe we can talk about this more when I have more information, right? I know how, especially if you know, a lot of policies are linked to like actual social injustice and things like that, and you want to solve them right away, right? But it's important that, you know, we're clear on like why it's a problem, because let's say you go do your research and you understand all this other information. Even if you maintain your position that you had at the beginning, by understanding where their arguments are coming from, it can better help, in a political sense, it can better help like come up with a compromise solution. But it can also, well, yeah, I'm going to say no, it can help come up with a solution that benefits both parties, right? Or at least is more of a compromise than I win or you win, something like that. So yeah, if you don't have a lot of information, go into it humble. See what you can learn, and then go back to the drawing board and find out more. Yeah, 1 second. Oh, someone's gonna give me an economics question. Let me see. Share this, and then 1 moment. Let me start up my page. Where was that thing? Oh, what happened? Oh, there's one. Sorry. Give me 1 moment. Okay, that was under. Too far. I don't know where that slide is.
It's all right.
Yeah, I'll find it in a second. But go ahead. I'll listen while I'm looking.
So, like, you mentioned like something about
Here it is.
like there's the empirical world, social world.
Yeah.
And the empirical world is less control. And yeah, and then I think this statement kind of stuck with me because that statement is both facts that people want, which gives us some control and certainty.
Yeah.
But that second part, which we made, this where the polarization comes from, is a hypothesis.
Yeah.
And us as social scientists, yes, we're trying to get facts, but we live in a probabilistic, uncertain world full of hypotheses that I find hard to convey to like my family members.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it seems like this affective polarization is people holding on to their hypothesis as a factual relationship when we know it's an unobserved. So how do we make that? How do we make hypotheses? How do we get people to accept hypotheses as they are? Because it seems like all these arguments that people have with each other are based on hypotheses.
Yeah. So the question is, I kind of referenced this earlier, right? We're talking about like this indefinite language, right? So the question is, a lot of people's conflicts are based on the fact that they're smashing their hypotheses against each other without, because this is as you say, a probabilistic world. We don't really know what the right answer is in a lot of these situations. And so how do we get people to stop leaning so heavily on hypotheticals? Right. So one is better science education, and I do think there was one there was one tip that I was going to add in here that I didn't add in here. I think that there was an experiment where they primed people with scientific methodology, and it also reduced polarization. I didn't think that was like going to be useful for a Thanksgiving talk or whatever. But yeah, I mean, understanding what, like, letting people know, I mean, without being pedantic about it, letting people know like what part of the process they're relying on in this kind of like attempt to get an empirical understanding of the world can be useful, right? And I've had mixed success with this at best, but I often say, I paraphrase almost exactly what you said. It's like, you've come up with an interesting hypothesis based on this evidence. But we don't know for sure, right? And there's this other competing evidence that leads to other hypotheses, and we won't know for a fact which one's correct until we observe it. And then so the best we can do is to look at the evidence for both of them, right? And we can compare those, and we might not agree about how that works, but just as long as we understand that neither of us knows for what's going to happen for sure, right? And so I don't, I'm not going to say you're wrong, and you shouldn't say I'm wrong either, because we don't know yet. But yeah, there was this. I wasn't sure about the timing, so I left it out. But there's this really cool article. If you email me, I'll send it to you. It's about like, you just prime people with like the scientific method, and then it like tends to like make them less extreme or something. So I thought it was pretty cool. Do we have any? Yeah.
Becoming more critical to get this type of information. What, in your opinion, is the best way to get this type of information from psychology of politics?
Okay. Yeah. So how do we, assuming that what I've said is valuable here, how do we push this information out to the public? I mean, I'm trying to do that now, right? I mean, that's kind of, that's why I'm here. Yeah, so, I mean, I think it's a multi-pronged effort, right? I mean, you got to have activists that are like pushing for this kind of stuff to be taught in certain places. You're going to have, you know, there are people with a vested interest in reducing affective polarization, right? You know, you can kind of see this in the Republican Party right now. Is they're not, you know, there's this this divide in the Republican Party over whether or not we're going to be this affectively polarized, you know, outrage factory that's all about, you know, getting a relative advantage over other people, or kind of a party that has like classically, you know, fiscally conservative values about like, you know, reducing the size of government and things like that. And so there are like, you know, vested interests in like reducing this type of affective polarization. There are like, you know, again, in this example, there are Republican leaders that don't like the state of things. They don't like the fact that, you know, some of them openly don't like the fact that Donald Trump, you know, kind of took over the party essentially. So, but yeah, I mean, I think, you know, because everyone has to go through it, I think education is kind of the best, most efficient way we could get this information out. And I hope that what I presented here didn't come off as partisan. And if it did, I apologize. That wasn't my intent. But if you can have this kind of like ideologically neutral, you know, just presentation of, you know, this is what's happening in your head. This is why it's a problem. I think that can be more palatable to you know, getting people to be more critical about issues. Then okay, so even though this isn't happening, right, you can see the backlash to like threats of critical race theory in public education, which so far isn't, I mean, you know, there's always going to be like some like rare exceptions, but like trying to push a specific message that's kind of like ideological, I think is an approach that's kind of being tried in a lot of ways. And I think there's going to be resistance to that. Whereas something that's, you know, again, as neutral as I'm possible to make it at least, can be more kind of amenable, right? But you have to, it takes a certain kind of mindset to recognize that this isn't like, you know, a left or a right problem. This is a psychology problem. And I think if you can like get that message out, I think it's going to be more palatable if you try to implement it in an educational setting. Yeah.
So, in my personal experience, anecdotal references to others' hypocrisy. But person X who agreed with you about Y, programming did Z. Frequent response to efforts to engage in factual, mutually respectful discussions of political issues. Do you have any suggestions for getting around this tactic without crossing?
Yeah. So the question is, a lot of times when you are trying to take a position or make an argument, someone will say, well, you know, the thing that you're doing is hypocritical, or the person that you're relying on is a hypocrite. Ergo, what you're saying is wrong. So, I mean, just logically, that's not necessarily, that doesn't follow logically, right? Oh, and I did mean to mention, I have a supplemental talk that I did a little while ago, and maybe Katie will post it with where this is posted, where I talk more about biases and logical fallacies and how to like kind of understand and incorporate those into conversation. I do recommend checking it out if this was at all useful to you. But yeah, so that's not, but to the question itself, I mean, that doesn't invalidate a point that you're trying to make, right? So, I mean, this is an extreme kind of illustrative example. But if Hitler says to eat your broccoli, that doesn't mean broccoli's bad for you, right? It you know, just because Hitler said it doesn't invalidate it as an argument, right? And so, again, extreme example, but oh, well, yeah. We can debate about it. But you know, so I mean, what I usually do is, well, first of all, I usually try not to rely on, you know, these kinds of anecdotal evidence in the first place. I try to rely on kind of, you know, peer-reviewed evidence if I can at all. So I don't, you know, when I personally discuss politics, you know, if I'm trying to say, for example, we need to protect the environment, or we need to like address climate change or something, I'm less likely to say something like, because, you know, Joe Biden supports it, right? Because there are good reasons to make my argument without that. I don't need this person that can be viewed as flawed in the first place to make the argument. And so I generally tend not to get myself into that trap in the first place. But if you do get into that trap, you know, you can point out that that doesn't follow logically, right? What they should be assessing is the evidence you're presenting and how it relates to your claim. Any other?
I might have a
sure.
But just sort of, you know, we started off the talk talking about growth and polarization generally, both affectively from politicians. And I'm wondering if you see anything that would this is something I just sort of wonder generally.
Like kind of organically?
Yeah, well, will this come at the individual level? Will this come at the
Yeah. So the question is, what you know, given these like kind of macro factors, maybe not what we can do individually, but are there any kind of like factors that might be reducing polarization? So one, if you look at this graph, at least in terms of the Congress, we're near max, right? We can't go much higher than complete polarization. So it can't, at least in Congress, it's not going to get too much worse. But so there are some things happening, right? There's HR1 is trying to kind of address some of these issues, trying to reduce like voting restrictions, trying to reduce gerrymandering, things like that, which can have an effect. Like the gerrymandering might, like, you know, kind of you know, prevent these kind of like safe districts that allow you to go full on extreme in Congress and things like that. That, you know, different social media companies are kind of moving in the direction of, you know, the heads of social media companies are being called into Congress to testify about, you know, allowing for like, you know, international actors to try to subvert our elections, or to organize for example, the January 6th attack on the Capitol. So I think there, you know, there are steps being taken to some degree, but it does seem more that they're taking steps to treat the symptoms and not the causes, right? You know, I mean, I don't want to. There are a lot of things I would do to like change, you know, the structure of American government. You know, like one of the things that leads to affective polarization is our two-party system, right? Parties that are in a coalitional governments tend to bounce back and forth between who's their allies and who's their opponents, and so they don't have this like constant competition between these two parties like we have in the United States. And so, you know, there are things we could do to like change that kind of, I mean, could do, right? You know, if we had a magic wand. But unfortunately, at least from my perspective, I don't see any major factors coming in to kind of like reverse this. And yeah, sorry to say.
Join me in thanking Celaya.
Thank you all. If you have any questions about any of this, I have my email address on the slides here, and I think we'll put the slides up with the event as well. But yeah, thank you all so much for attending.